are so glad that you are here. We are in the middle of summer, depending on what the weather looks like. And with that, here at Cross Church, we got a lot going on. Just this last week, our kids and our youth all went to camp. We took kids and we brought the same number back, okay? So we didn't leave any there. We didn't pick up any on the way. We brought them all back, but they had a fantastic time. We'll see a little recap at the very end of our service today. So just thank you for your prayers in that. But our summer festivities continue. And so one of the next things that we're starting this week is on Tuesdays and Thursdays, we're kind of extending our Bible groups that we usually take a break from, but we're doing something a little different. We're doing 6-week studies for men and women on Tuesday nights, men on Thursday nights, and we invite you to be a part of that. If you grabbed a sermon notes, kind of little bulletin is an old school way of saying this, on your way in, I don't even know where mine is, but there's a QR code on the front of that you can scan and let us know you're coming, sign up for that. We'd love to have you there as we just kind of study and see what God has for us this summer and kind of grow in this season of heat. Well, today we are continuing our series through the book of 1 Peter. And we've been in 1st and we're going to be in 2 Peter once we finish this. And today, as we kind of come to this passage, Peter uses some language here where he kind of talks to us like adults, which is probably an important thing, right? But sometimes we are talked to like adults, but if we're honest, there's parts of our lives that aren't very adult-like, where we still kind of act like children. And this is not a problem to us, this is a problem on our societal scale level. So I want to open today, I want to read some statistics for us. And I am just the bearer of statistics, so if you are offended or angry at these are numbers, these are not my opinion, okay? So you be mad at the numbers and I'll just leave it there. But here are just some stats on our society and kind of the trajectory we're going. Here, let me start with this one. Is adults age 18 to 29 living with their parents? In 1980, that percentage, this is in America, was 32% in 1980. Fast forward to 2020, 52%. I'm glad there was a laugh there. I'm glad I'm not the only one laughing, okay. If you're in that age group and you live with your parents, I'm sorry, don't be offended. Stats, that's what I'm going back to, stats, okay. Adults married at 21, by 21, went from 33% in 1980. Oh, this one's depressing. 2021, 6%. 33% to 6%. The average age of being married in 1980 was 25 for men, 22 for women. That is now in 2022, 30 for men and 28 for women. And this last one I'll close with. Adults with full-time jobs at 21, 64% in 1980, 39% in 2021. I think we're done here. No. Here's the deal. We live in a society that is increasingly pushing off the age of just growing up. And I'm not going to get on a soapbox here and kind of go on some angry rant, I promise. I probably have that rant in me, but today is not the time or place to do that. But here's, as we kind of look at this, and there are reasons for this, and then I just want to there's merits of why some of this trend has happened. One is the fact that we've moved from more of kind of a rural to an urban and suburban culture. We have gone more from agricultural to corporate lifestyles, meaning you used to have kids and they were free labor. You have kids now and they cost a ton of money and never make that money back for you, okay? I left my parents' house and I'm not giving them a dime. I just took all my money and ran, okay? And increasingly, it's going this direction, but part of this is also we're becoming a more technological and a less personal society. And here's the point, is our society at large is failing to grow up, failing to move forward. But here's the deal of what we're gonna kind of talk about today, is I'm not gonna get on a soapbox about our society, but I'm gonna let Peter get on a soapbox about the church spiritually. And here's the real issue, is spiritually inside the church, we refuse to grow up. And as we get into our passage today, we're gonna see how oftentimes there are things in our life that we know we need to move past, or things in our life we know we need to adapt, but something in us just wants to cling to our childhood foolishness. Here's our key thought as we start today, that a decision to follow Jesus is a decision to grow up. Here's the deal. If you want to stay the same, if you don't want your life to change, if you are happy with you where you are, do not follow Jesus. Because he is going to look at your life, and as you pursue him, he's gonna be like, yeah, that crap needs to stop. I'm circling that and get that out of here. Okay, here's where you're lazy. We need to start doing this. And Jesus is gonna pick apart your life and say, I don't like the old you. I love you, but I don't like your old stuff. We need to change. And you see, increasingly, as we go down this path of following who Christ is, the Christian life is all about change and growth. But here's the good news, is I think you know that. And you wouldn't be here if you loved your life and everything about it. I'm sure there are parts of you that you do not like. I'm sure there are parts of you, a sin you fall into, and you know it's wrong. You know it's not good for you. And when you do it, a part of yourself hates you. But there's this God who can help change you and love you through it. And today, as we go through this, we're going to ask the question of how can I grow up? Spiritually, how can I grow into what Christ has for me and past the garbage that I'm in? Let's ask it this way, that kind of links in to what Peter has already talked about in 1 Peter chapter 2, is what does it look like to grow up into our salvation? In 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 2, we read this a few weeks ago. Peter says this, he tells us to rid ourselves of certain things, but then he says, like newborn infants, desire the pure milk of the word, that is the Bible. So listen to this, that you may grow up into your salvation. Today, as we get into 1 Peter chapter 4, we are going to look at what is it like to grow up into our salvation. And here's what I'm gonna ask you to do before we kind of get into this, is I want you to kind of take some of the blinders off. And I want you to be honest with yourself as we go through this, is examine your heart, examine your life. And if there are things as we're going through this, they'd be like, yeah, no, that's not good for me. Be honest about it. If there are things in your life, you're like, oh yeah, I really need to get rid of that. If there are things that you need to start doing and stop doing, stop lying to yourself and be honest before God and ask him, how can I start to change this? Paul puts it this way in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 11. He says, when I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put aside childish things. If you're honest in your life, there's probably something childish that you need to put aside. In order to be the person, the man, the woman that God called you to be, there are things that we need to put aside in order to fully pursue him. So as we go through this passage, I want you to do a lot of self-examination and reflection and ask God, how do you take me from where I am right now to where you want me to go? And here's the first way we need to grow up into our salvation. And the first point we're gonna see is we need to grow past our former sin. 1 Peter chapter 4, starting in verse 1, let's read, and it says this. He says, therefore, since Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves. Listen to that language. That's not light language. Peter says, arm yourselves also with the same understanding, because the one who suffers in the flesh is finished with sin, in order to live the remaining time in the flesh, no longer for human desires, but for God's will. For there has already been enough time spent in doing what the Gentiles choose to do, carrying on an unrestrained behavior, evil desires, drunkenness, orgies, carousing, and lawless idolatry. Let's stop right there and let's kind of spend some time sifting through this. And here's the deal, is this letter that was written by Peter, if you've been with us through this time, or to kind of catch you up a little bit, it has been written with this theme of pursuing holiness. Of how can I be more like this guy Jesus that I claim to follow and less like my former sinful life. And as Peter's walked us down this journey, he's been very understanding. He's kind of given us a theological argument of it. He's given us practical ways we can start to put this in place. He's given us encouragement that why all this is possible is because of what Jesus did on the cross and dying for our sins, but raising again. And then here he kind of gets and he becomes a little more bold in his language. And like there's almost a shift in tone here, and I can feel it in Peter. He's like, I've been yelling at you guys for a while, and some of you just aren't getting it. He's writing to Andrew 2,000 years later. He's like, you're a child, grow up, right? I just look like a child. I'm not totally a child, okay? But he kind of takes this. He's like, okay, something needs to change. And here he says, Christ suffered for us because we were too sinful to save ourselves. Now he moves and says, now we need to live like something in our life has actually changed. What we talked about last week is we looked at the fact that Christ suffered for us to save us. And we said the response to that is now we suffer for Christ because we are saved. But Peter takes it a step further here, and he says, now, because of that, stop running back to your old sinful ways. Now, as I was reading this and I was thinking about it, often when we talk about sin in the church and we talk about our mistakes in the church, one of the easiest things to do that we can all fall into this trap is we start to blame everything outside of us, right? You always want to point the finger at everyone besides yourself. Be like, hey, you know what? I know I have my problems, but the world is pretty messed up. Like, have you seen our society? Have you seen our culture? We live in a culture of giant children, as our statistics said, right? Like, it's not my fault, it's the world's fault. The world is sinful. It's becoming less ethical. It's becoming less moral. Like, I can just blame, I can blame. And then when we talk, have a little discussion with Peter through the text, we're like, Peter, it was just different in your day. You walked with Jesus. You lived in the Roman Empire. I'm sure it was really fun and accepting of everyone. You're like, it's just so much more sinful now in 2023. Let's read the second half of verse 3 again. He said, there's enough time spent in doing what the Gentiles choose to do. Listen to the list he about to rallies off here. Carrying on in unrestrained behavior, evil desires, drunkenness, orgies, that really escalated, carousing in lawless idolatry. This is what was happening 2,000 years ago. As Peter is writing to the early church, these people who had seen Jesus in the flesh, who said, I want to commit my life to following this guy, Peter still has to write them and say, stop going to orgies, guys. And Paul does the same thing to the church in Corinth, okay? It's crazy. It's mind-blowing. And we just think, look at this list again. It says he's saying they have no self-control. He's saying they have immoral and unethical boundaries. He says they drink too much, that they're having these orgies, these sex parties, that they're wandering around intoxicated, and they're breaking the law and they're worshiping stuff. And the encouragement here is the people in Peter's day were super messed up too. And when you look at your life, and you look at society and you said, man, I am so jacked up. Man, I am so messed up. When I come to church and I sing a worship song, all of a sudden, all the bad things I did the last month and week and everything else come into my mind. People have always been messed up. You're no different. But just because you're no different doesn't mean that you shouldn't also try through the power of Christ to get over this stuff. And Peter tells us straight up, he's like, hey, Christ suffered for you. So knock it off. Stop doing these things. Stop acting like the world and instead be set apart. Let me give a little adult tip in here that I think kind of goes a little bit stepping out of this passage, but I think that is so important just in line with scripture. And is that medicating with sin will always fall short of healing with God. This is very much it's probably not verbatim, but this is totally a CR, Celebrate Recovery concept. And this is the idea of so often, you're like, why do I sin over and over? And why do I keep running back to the things? It's not because you're a terrible person. It's because life happens. And when you get depressed, when you get stressed, when you get bored, when you get angry, whatever that is, you start running to your pet sin. And it makes you feel better. It's like an addiction. It's like a high. And it works for a little bit. It makes me feel that much better. But then not much time passes and all of a sudden you have this gaping hole in your heart again. And Peter's like, stop doing that. You're taking medicine that you think will heal the wound, but the only thing that will truly heal it is the grace of Jesus Christ. And Peter gives us this over and over again that, hey, we're on this pursuit. We're going to church because we want to know Jesus more. And we have some sin in our life, and the only way that we're going to get rid of it is when we pursue him and not the sin in our lives. You see, what our desires hope to fix in our lives, only God can truly heal with his love and his grace. So Peter tells us that we need to grow past our sin, but he also tells us that we need to grow past our former support. Check out verse 4. As we continue on here, he says, they are surprised, being the world, the Gentiles at this time. Gentile would really kind of mean not the church, is how he's using this. He says they are surprised that you don't join them in the same flood of wild living, and they slander you. But he says they will give an account to the one who stands ready to judge the living and the dead. Verse 6, for this reason the gospel was also preached to those who are now dead, so that although they might be judged in the flesh according to human standards, they might live in the spirit according to God's standards. You see, Peter, as he moves through this passage, he moves on from focusing on the sin to focusing on the sinners. And he tells us here that when we leave a lifestyle of sin, that there may be a remnant of people there who don't want to leave that sin. Let me give you an example. Say you struggle with alcoholism, and say you are like, I can't just drink socially, but I am a raging alcoholic, and you say, something in my life needs to change. Say you are saved, you come to a faith in Christ, and you say, I'm done with that, I'm leaving it behind. You know who's not going to be happy about that? All your friends who just missed their drinking buddy to go get wasted with. Now let me sidestep out of this. When you are saved by the grace of God, you are a great witness to those around you. And I never say, don't cut off your old life and say, hey, sorry, I love Jesus now, so I can't ever speak to you again. Like, no, don't usually do that. Like, that is sometimes the greatest opportunity you have, is to share the gospel and share the love of Jesus Christ with those who don't know him. And one of the dangers of sometimes being too insulated in church is we only know holy people and we become a holy huddle instead of knowing lost people and loving our entire world. But there are going to be times when that group keeps sapping you and keeps dragging you back into that lifestyle. And Peter says, in that case, drastic measures need to be taken. Here's our adult tip under this, is that sometimes moving on from a destructive lifestyle, it can often mean moving on from destructive people. There are times when your support system needs to go. There are times when you say, hey, I love my friends, I love them so much, or my family, or whatever this is, but I can't spend as much time with them if every time I go into that relationship, it's constantly dragging me into my addictions, dragging me into my sins, dragging me in to be a former person I used to be and not the person I want to be in Christ. And Peter's saying, hey, this is going to be hard. He's like, you might be mocked for it. You might be thrown daggers for it, but it's the way to go. A great way to illustrate this and see how impactful and how big this happens is you're like, just because I leave, that doesn't mean my addiction goes behind just if I change my scenery. But actually, that can happen in a very big degree in many ways. During the Vietnam War, soldiers that were deployed in Vietnam, they were kind of right there in the middle in the country of heroin was available like crazy. And they're in wartime, so they're stressed. They're literally fighting for their lives. They're in jungles. So it was estimated during the Vietnam War, US soldiers that were deployed in country, 34% of them were regularly using heroin during the war. 20% of those were actually addicted physically to where when they stopped using it, they had withdrawals. But here's the crazy thing. When all those soldiers came back home and they went back to their old lifestyles, didn't have access to the drug anymore, weren't even by the same stressors, the same crowd that they were before, only 1% of all soldiers ever relapsed and went back to that drug. And you see, sometimes a change of scenery is exactly what you need. Sometimes you need to lift out of your former life. You need to get to a new group, a new people, a new scenery that God can truly change you. And as hard as it is at those times, sometimes you need to move on from people in your life if they're constantly just pulling you back into that sin. You see, these first two, I think, are kind of the hardest ones that we talk about, is how do we grow past our former sins? How do we grow past our former support? And it all involves stopping things that sometimes we want to do or we feel we want to do, some things we are addicted to. But these are the biggest ones. These are the hardest ones. And these next ones aren't easy, but I almost feel like it's going on a hike. Some of the hikes I love to do are like you kind of go up and it can be pretty steep and I want to die on the way up. But then once you get up there, you kind of can coast a little bit. And you have some areas that are nice and downhill, then you go uphill, but it's not as high, so it feels nice, it's hard, but then you get a little relief, and you kind of get this little sway. And then you get to look down and be like, hey, if I got all the way up here, I know I have the power to get all the way down. And on the back half of this growing up, we're gonna see what are the things we start to do. And here's the crazy thing is when God stops some things in your life, he doesn't do it without starting some great things. And the first good way that we grow up into things is we grow towards self-discipline. Check out verse 7. 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 7. He says, the end of all things is near. Told you he was getting intense in this. Therefore, be alert and sober-minded for prayer. We said before that Peter started to raise the stakes in verse 1 of chapter 4, kind of from the rest of this letter. He starts to get a little more intense in this, where there's a kind of this sense of urgency. But here he takes it to another level. And here he just straight up says, the end is near. He says, we are living in end times. Now, when you read that, you're like, what in the world does that mean? Because maybe you've seen some like crazy pastor or like a shaman or someone show up on TV before and say like, hey, 2034, that's the end of the world. Remember Y2K when we all thought it was gonna blow up? I was reflecting on that this week. I was like, we thought all the computers were just gonna blow up. And then midnight happened and we're like, and nothing happened. It's just 2000 now. But here's what that means is that we're living in end times, meaning ever since Jesus came back, that actually started the chapter of end times. And you're like, well, it doesn't seem like it's ending very soon. It's been 2,000 years plus. But when Jesus came the first time and he left and was resurrected, it started the trend of eventually he's gonna come back. And when he comes back, there's no more Mr. Nice Jesus. He's coming with a sword and he's coming with judgment. And the perfect, holy Jesus is gonna judge the entire world. But what Peter here is saying is that the end is near and we have to live with urgency towards it. Also, on a side note, if you want proof that the end is near, Apple just put augmented reality Vision Pro glasses that they announced last week. Literally, the end of the world is coming. You put on goggles, you have a computer, you can watch a movie screen, you don't have to talk to any people anymore. You can just have your goggles and control your entire life from there. And if that with artificial intelligence, the end is near. So that's all I'll say. You ever seen Terminator or any sci-fi movie? We know we are screwed soon. But on a serious note, Jesus here, he's saying, hey, we don't know how much time we have. And even if we're not here when Jesus literally comes back, you don't know how many days you have in your life. We live in a crazy, broken, sinful world. Terrible things happen all the time. And we need to live in a way that values our day, that values our life, and shows that we are living for something. So here's what Peter tells us to do, is he says, live like a grown-up Christian. And part of that is self-discipline. Recently, I have started literally over the past month, after hearing Scott talk to me like I treat my body like a child all the time. If you know who Scott is, he does our announcements at the end. He's ripped, he looks great, and he's old, but he's still like, in great shape. He's gonna beat me up later. I might be a teensy bit faster than him. But anyway, but he's like, hey, you gotta start like treating your body like you're not a high schooler anymore. You gotta start taking things like vitamins and supplements. And guess what? A month ago, I started taking vitamins and supplements. I've never felt older in my life. But I'm like, this is part of being an adult, right? Is like I wake up earlier than my kids. I make sure, I was never a morning person, but now I'm having to be a morning, but I wake up early. I do things like go for a walk, or I do things that are active. I take vitamins because I'm not a child anymore. And when I hurt myself, I don't bounce right back like children, okay? Like my kids hit their head on something, I think they're dead, and they pop up 2 minutes later and they're like, I'm fine, nothing happened. I'm like, and I'd be in the hospital, right? And here, part of this is all of a sudden we have to start acting like adults. We have to start disciplining the lives around us. Peter uses this words. He says we need to be alert. We need to be sober-minded, meaning that we are sharp and we are ready. We are not drunk and lazy, meaning we are disciplined in how we structure our time, how we structure our energy. And all of this, he points to the fact of we do this so we can spend more time seeking God, praying to him, and finding out what is his will for our life. Ask yourself, how do I do in this category? Where is my discipline at? What do I need to start doing that I know is not good for me? Where do I need to wake up a little bit earlier so I can get that much more done before my life becomes chaos with work and kids and everything else? Is how do I need to discipline myself to better follow him? But we also grow towards God and grow up as a Christian in our spiritual lives as we grow towards steady love and care. Check out verse 8. He says, above all, maintain constant love for one another, since love covers a multitude of sin. Be hospitable to one another without complaining. Now, as I said before, I do believe like this second half of like the things we should start are easier than the things we should stop. But it's easier, but that doesn't mean it's not hard still. And you see, the more we get into not sinning, the more God pours kind of holiness into us, and these things become naturally, but at that same time, it is still not easy. Listen to what Peter tells us. He says, be loving and hospitable. And honestly, loving and hospitable is not always a fun thing to do, especially in Phoenix and rush hour, right? I saw like a thing, a post or a meme or something that, Phoenix is rush hour. The morning is from 5 a.m. to noon, and the afternoon is from noon to 8 o'clock, right? That's how it works. There's always traffic, and there's always stupid people that do stupid things that make you really angry. But what does it show to keep loving, to keep being hospitable? A few weeks ago, we had Memorial Day, and me and my wife, we have 3 kids, so we're busy, and whenever we keep a clean house, but it's always, when we host people, it's always gonna be madness, because my kids aren't, all of a sudden they're like calm, nice at home, and then people come over and they become like little Tasmanian devils or something. I'm like, what happened to you? All of a sudden you're crazy. So we had a Memorial Day party, and brought all these people over, cooked a bunch of food. I'm looking at my pool, it's just full of children who are probably all peeing in my pool, and I have to put more chemicals in. And I'm like, this isn't easy to do. This is a lot of work to prepare for. This is a lot of work to make all this food. But the whole time I was like, I don't regret this one bit. I love doing this. I love hosting people. And there's like an old man deep down inside of me that I really am just grouchy and angry most of the time. But somehow God has transformed me to be like, no, I need to love people. I need to be hospitable towards people. I need to show him the love of Christ in all the ways I can. And you see, as we pursue him, as we become a spiritual adult, being a grown-up means that we love people even when it's hard. We love people even when they're jerks to us. And we care for them even when they're not caring towards us, and even when they don't reciprocate that care. But part of being a grown-up, part of being an adult Christian is we just keep modeling Christ even when it's hard. Which brings us to our last one. Is the last way as we kind of talk about growing into a spiritual adult, a spiritual Christian in here, is we grow towards service and stewardship. Check out verse 10. He says, just as each one of you has received a gift, use it to serve others as good stewards of the varied grace of God. Here's the deal, is God didn't save you so that you could keep everything to yourself. God saved you so you could be a service and that you could be a resource to other people. You see, God didn't give you the gift of your personality, despite what anyone says. Your personality is a gift, okay? It's a gift for someone. If someone's ever told you it's not, it is. That was a joke, so don't take that too seriously if you're angry about that. But God gave you the gift of your personality, of your skills, of your abilities, and all of that he gave you, not so you could keep it to yourself, but that you could share it with other people. You see, everything we have is by the grace of God, and God expects us to share that with other people. This past Saturday, not this Saturday, but Saturday before, I took my son Archie to go see the new Spider-Man, which was awesome, okay? It was a cartoon, it was an animated movie, greatest animated movie I've ever seen. Like, tops Aladdin and Lion King, I'm just gonna say that. But before we went, we stopped and I'm like, let's go get candy. And we went to the Dollar Tree to get candy on the way to the movie theater, and I had my free, like my popcorn and my Harkins cup and stuff. He's like, why don't we just get candy at the movie theater? I'm like, because it's $6 for something we can get for $1. And he goes, well, I have $6, I could just buy it at the movie theater. I'm like, well, you do in your little wallet, but still. I'm like, but we could get like 5 of them at the dollar store for that. And like I was trying to teach him, he couldn't get it in his head and understand the concept. He's like, well, I could buy it there. And I'm like, but here's the thing, is similar to that, he has his money, he doesn't know how to steward it yet as a 5-year-old, right? And us, sometimes as adults, we don't know how to steward the resources God gives us. We're like, oh, I can afford it. I'm just going to blow all my resources, my time, my energy, my talents, my personality. I'm just going to spend it on whatever I want, what's convenient when I want to. And God's like, no. I gave you that to steward it so you could serve other people, so you could love other people, that you could be a service to the world around you. And as we get older, we see the value more and more of the responsibility we have of to use the God-given gifts we have for other people in our lives, to help serve them and steward it the way that God has given us. Here's the deal. The truth of all of this is being an adult is not easy. Often, let's be honest, being an adult is pretty terrible. There's days where you're like, man, this is not fun. Can I just go back? Can I just run back to my childhood when I could just watch movies all day and play my Game Boy Color and just play Pokemon for hours on end? Can I just go back to the old and be childish and be ignorant and live my old life? But God's like, no. I grew you up out of that for a reason, so that you could start making a difference in the world, that you can start being the men and women who change the landscape of our communities, of not just complain about all the bad things that are happening, but how can we share a hope of the world with those around us? How can we do something that is amazing? And how can we grow out of our childish tendencies into doing something amazing on behalf of God? Listen to how Peter closes this out. And I just love this in verse 11 here, as he kind of talks about this idea and builds into this of what is our responsibility, of what does it look like to be this grown-up spiritual adult. And he says it like this: if anyone speaks, let it be as one who speaks God's words. If anyone serves, let it be that from the strength that God provides, so that God may be glorified through Jesus Christ. In everything, to him be the glory and the power forever and ever. Amen. Here's our bottom line that we're going to close out with today, is that following Jesus is about growing into the men and women who glorify him in everything. You see, it's hard to be a Christian. It's hard to be a grown-up. But all of 1 Peter has shown us and told us that God died for you because he had something better for you. He had a greater life for you. Jesus suffered on the cross to save you from something you couldn't save yourself from. But he didn't do this so we could stay the same. He didn't do this so that our lives would look just like our former lives, that we'd be stuck in our old sin. He did this so we could be better, that we could be better people, that we could be stronger people, that we could be more holy people, not for our own glory, but to glorify the God who makes it all possible. So here's how I want to end today, is I want you to spend some time asking your Heavenly Father to do that work in you. Because it can be really easy to say, yeah, it's true. I need to grow up. I think that every day I'm on the couch doing nothing when I'm tired on a Saturdays. I need to grow up, I need to go do something. But sometimes if we don't really reflect, if we don't ask the hard questions, if we don't see God in the moment, and we make a plan on how we're actually gonna do it, then nothing's really gonna change. So at this time, we're gonna go into a time of prayer. And this is gonna be you and the Father. No one else. No one to lie to. No one to make false promises to. But you to fall on your face before him and say, God, what do I need to stop doing? And what do I need to start doing?